Imagine an actor who could capture the hearts of mystery fans and create a devoted following without ever seeking the spotlight. Darren McGavin was different from typical Hollywood stars. He wasn't chasing big movie success or fame. Instead, his work became deeply embedded in popular culture, sometimes even when he didn't want it to be. McGavin played two very different but memorable characters. First was the raincoat-wearing reporter who helped create an entire genre of television. Then came the grumpy but caring father in a beloved holiday movie. These roles shaped moments that fans still love today, decades after they first appeared on screen. But there's an interesting twist to his story. Behind the cameras, McGavin was restless and rebellious. He often criticized the very roles that made him famous. The real story of what happened to him after his peak years is both surprising and almost hard to believe. You might think you know his career, but you probably don't know the whole truth. Once you learn what became of him, you'll see his work in a completely new light. The story begins in 1974 with a modest television series called Kolchak, the Night Stalker. The show appeared quietly on television without much fanfare. There were no big expectations or massive advertising campaigns. It was simply a quirky detective story about a rumpled newspaper reporter who had a talent for finding trouble. McGavin's character, Carl Kolchak, wasn't a smooth, cigar-smoking leading man. He was the guy with worn-out shoes, a beat-up tape recorder, and a straw hat that had clearly seen better days. He made jokes while dealing with uncooperative police officers and brushed off bureaucratic excuses. Kolchak chased stories that no one else dared to investigate, and those stories almost always led to vampires, werewolves, or other strange creatures that authorities pretended didn't exist. The show only lasted one season. On paper, that should have been the end of it, but Kolchak refused to disappear. Something about McGavin's performance struck a chord with viewers. He combined determined investigation with dry humor in a way that deeply resonated with a small but incredibly loyal audience. Fans began trading VHS tapes like they were secret contraband. They hosted viewing parties in basements and analyzed every episode for hidden meanings. To these devoted viewers, Kolchak wasn't just a television character. He was an underground hero, an ordinary person fighting dark forces that polite society chose to ignore. Many fans would later say the series was the direct inspiration for The X-Files, pointing to its eerie cases, skeptical law enforcement, and relentless truth seeker at the center. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. McGavin himself wasn't particularly enjoying the cult following. He saw himself as a working actor with a restless nature who thrived on variety and didn't want to be trapped in one type of role. Kolchak had been just one job among many in his long career. While he enjoyed parts of the role, he didn't like the idea of being forever defined by it. In interviews, McGavin often downplayed the show's importance. He criticized its hurried scripts and production problems. Strangely, these very criticisms only seemed to make fans more fascinated. The more he tried to distance himself from the character, the more the legend grew around him. By the late 1980s and 1990s, the underground fan movement had spread worldwide. Conventions invited him to appear. Fan magazines printed grainy photographs from old sets, and early internet forums buzzed with debates about favorite episodes. In these circles, Darren McGavin wasn't just an actor. He was a symbol of determination, skepticism, and the fight for truth against impossible odds. Yet despite all this cult devotion, McGavin was already mentally moving on. He had no interest in living forever in Kolchak's shadow. His next major role would take him into a completely different world, one where there were no monsters lurking in shadows, but where the emotional stakes were somehow just as important. After years of trying to escape the supernatural baggage of Kolchak, McGavin found himself taking on a role in 1983 that would change his career and his place in popular culture forever. He became the old man Parker in A Christmas Story, playing the cantankerous father who presided over the chaotic Parker household. This was a man who battled the home furnace like it was his sworn enemy. He muttered colorful complaints under his breath and had a heart that only showed itself in rare, unguarded moments. The movie production itself was far from glamorous. It was a modestly budgeted holiday film directed by Bob Clark, with no guarantee of box office success and no big marketing campaign behind it. On set, McGavin approached the role with the precision of a craftsman. He grounded the old man in lived-in reality. He didn't play him as a cartoon dad or an overly sentimental figure. Instead, he played him as that gruff, imperfect, oddly endearing father that so many people remembered from their own childhoods. There was the sly grin when the infamous leg lamp arrived, the way he quietly supported his son after the BB gun victory, the triumphant joy he felt at winning a dinner table argument. These moments were stitched together not from theatrical flourish, but from genuine truth. When the film was first released, it barely made a splash. Reviews were mixed and ticket sales were modest. But something unexpected began happening over the next decade. Cable television channels, hungry for seasonal programming, started showing it every December. Slowly, a pattern developed. Families began tuning in year after year. Parents introduced it to their children. Lines from the movie became part of the cultural holiday vocabulary. McGavin's muttered one-liners and fierce furnace battles became as essential to the Christmas season as stockings and eggnog. By the time A Christmas Story had established itself as a true holiday staple, eventually running in 24-hour marathons on television, McGavin had unknowingly joined the rare company of actors whose characters become part of annual tradition. He was no longer just Kolchak the Night Stalker. He was the old man, frozen in cinematic time, eternally presiding over Christmas in a cluttered 1940s living room. Unlike with Kolchak, McGavin didn't fight against this newfound fame. He spoke warmly in interviews about the role, acknowledging how deeply it connected with audiences. Fans would approach him with stories about how their own fathers reminded them of the old man, and he seemed genuinely moved by these encounters. For someone who once felt trapped by a character's shadow, this was different. This was a shadow that brought joy to people. But Hollywood, always quick to capitalize on what works, began seeing him through a narrower lens. Offers poured in for variations of the gruff but lovable patriarch, usually in safe, formulaic TV movies and sitcom guest appearances. For McGavin, who thrived on variety and surprise, it felt like a golden cage. Yes, it was comfortable and paid well, but it offered no risk, no challenge, and no room for the restless spirit that had driven him since his early career days. Soon he would push back against the industry's easy categorization, a move that puzzled producers, intrigued fans, and set up the next surprising chapter in his career. McGavin was never the kind of actor to sit quietly and accept whatever was offered to him. He had strong opinions and wasn't afraid to express them, even if it created problems in Hollywood boardrooms. After A Christmas Story became a seasonal phenomenon, scripts flooded in, but they all seemed to be carbon copies of each other. Another gruff dad, another wise but stubborn older man, another safe supporting role designed to tap into the warmth audiences felt during the holidays. McGavin refused to accept this limitation. This was a man who had fought hard to break into acting in the first place, working construction and painting sets in New York before making his breakthrough in the 1950s. He wasn't about to spend the rest of his career playing one-note characters in other people's cookie-cutter scripts. This attitude wasn't new for him. Even during his earlier work on shows like Mike Hammer and Riverboat, McGavin had openly criticized production choices, pacing, and writing, sometimes while still under contract. That bluntness often shocked producers, but it also earned him a reputation as someone who cared about the integrity of a project, not just the paycheck. Unfortunately, that same bluntness could also close doors. McGavin himself admitted that being outspoken cost him opportunities. The problem was that both Kolchak and the old man had become too big to escape. They weren't just roles anymore. They were cultural touchstones. Kolchak had loyal fans who saw him as the godfather of paranormal investigation, while A Christmas Story was turning into an annual ritual with McGavin as the face of fatherhood in millions of living rooms. How do you escape the gravitational pull of characters like that without disappointing everyone who loves them? McGavin's answer was to seek out work that felt unpredictable, even if it meant turning down more profitable offers. He took guest roles in shows like Murphy Brown and The X-Files, ironically returning to the supernatural genre he'd once tried to distance himself from, but always on his own terms. He preferred projects that surprised him, ones where he could experiment rather than simply repeat past successes. Still, the shadow of his successes loomed large. No matter where he went, interviews always circled back to Kolchak or A Christmas Story. He smiled through these conversations, but you could tell he was eager to talk about something new and different. As the 1990s progressed, McGavin began to retreat from the spotlight altogether. It was a quiet shift that left fans wondering what was really happening behind the scenes. By the mid-1990s, Darren McGavin's name was no longer regularly appearing on casting sheets the way it once had. He wasn't chasing the industry, and the industry wasn't pursuing him with the same intensity. This change wasn't because his skills had diminished. McGavin's talent and screen presence were still undeniable. The shift was in Hollywood itself. The business had become increasingly obsessed with youth-driven blockbusters and glossy, fast-paced entertainment. Veteran actors were often relegated to thin background roles that barely used their abilities. For a man who had built his career on presence, grit, and complex characters, the idea of fading quietly into the margins was unthinkable. McGavin, always fiercely independent, decided that if the right roles weren't being offered, he simply wouldn't take any roles at all. Instead, he began stepping back, choosing only occasional parts. A guest appearance on television here, a small supporting role in an independent film there. These moments kept him visible, but they were spaced far apart, creating long, silent stretches that left fans wondering if he had quietly retired. The speculation only grew stronger. Was he disillusioned with Hollywood's direction? Had he finally tired of the endless references to Kolchak and A Christmas Story in every interview, or was something else happening? Those who knew him best understood that McGavin was fundamentally a deeply private man. He had never been one to live for red car, pets, or constant publicity, and now he seemed determined to protect what remained of his personal life from the insatiable curiosity of the public eye. There were quiet rumors about health concerns, though McGavin himself never confirmed anything publicly. Friends described him as still sharp and quick-witted, still able to charm a room with a good story, but they also noticed a change. He was more reflective, more interested in looking back than planning his next big project. On the rare occasions when he did work, colleagues found him to be every bit the consummate professional. Lines were memorized, notes were carefully considered, and he maintained the same dry humor between takes. But there was a distance now, a subtle sense that he knew his time in front of the camera was winding down, and he was making peace with that reality. Meanwhile, without him lifting a finger to promote himself, his legacy was quietly solidifying. A Christmas Story had transformed from a modest holiday film into a full-fledged seasonal tradition, airing in 24-hour marathons every December. Kolchak, the Night Stalker, long out of production, was finding new life on DVD and in the growing online fan communities of the early internet. On message boards and in chat rooms, strangers shared behind-the-scenes photos, scanned old interviews, and exchanged memories of meeting him at conventions. Even in his absence, McGavin's name carried weight and respect. But this slow retreat from acting was about more than career politics or industry changes. It marked the opening of his final chapter, one that would unfold far from studio lights and scripted lines. When the truth about those last years finally emerged, it would leave even his most devoted fans surprised and moved. As the new millennium began, Darren McGavin was no longer a constant presence on television screens, but his influence could be felt everywhere. Younger actors cited him as an inspiration. Filmmakers pointed to Kolchak as the blueprint for entire genres of television and movies. And every December, A Christmas Story brought him into millions of homes across the country. Yet behind these enduring images, McGavin was living a life that few people knew about, one of deliberate quiet and peace. He had moved further away from the demands of Hollywood, choosing comfort and privacy over the grind of auditions and long shooting schedules. The decision was partly practical. Health challenges had begun to affect him, slowing the boundless energy he had once possessed. While he was never one to publicly dwell on illness or personal struggles, those close to him noticed changes. He attended fewer events, declined more invitations, and spent more time with a tight circle of friends and family members. The man who had once chased monsters on television now preferred peaceful afternoons. He often spent time reading, painting, or simply enjoying conversations without the weight of public expectation hanging over him. It was a quieter existence, but one that seemed to bring him genuine contentment. Even during this quieter period, the outside world kept reaching out to him. Fan letters arrived steadily, some from people who had grown up watching Kolchak battle impossible creatures and supernatural forces. Others came from families who gathered around A Christmas Story each year as part of their holiday tradition. McGavin, ever gracious, answered these letters when he could, sometimes signing photographs or writing short notes of thanks. He understood the power those roles held for people, even if he had spent years wrestling with their overwhelming presence in his life. By the mid-2000s, his public appearances were rare, and each one carried special weight. When he did speak publicly, his words felt reflective and thoughtful. Here was a man taking stock of the strange, winding journey from set builder to cult icon. He spoke candidly about the projects he had loved, the compromises he regretted, and the joy of having played characters that continued to live on long after the cameras stopped rolling. In 2006, Darren McGavin passed away at the age of 83. The news rippled through fan communities first, then spread to mainstream headlines, sparking a wave of tributes and remembrances. Those who had followed him for decades mourned not just the loss of a talented actor, but the loss of a particular spirit, one that balanced stubborn independence with a deep respect for storytelling and craft. As the years have passed since his death, his legacy hasn't dimmed or been forgotten. Instead, it has evolved and grown in ways he might never have expected. Every time a viewer discovers Kolchak's gravelly voice narrating a supernatural case, or laughs at the old man's battle with a stubborn furnace, McGavin is there, alive in the work that outlived him. But perhaps the most surprising part is that even after all this time, new aspects of his story are still being discovered and shared, and they continue to change the way people see him and appreciate his contributions to entertainment. Darren McGavin's story isn't just about the roles he played on screen. It's about the strange, almost poetic way that art outlives the artist, often in forms they never could have predicted or imagined. He began as a man scrambling for work in an unforgiving industry, taking odd jobs behind the scenes before earning his place in front of the camera. Through determination, instinct, and an unwillingness to compromise his principles, he built a career that somehow made him the face of two vastly different worlds: the shadowy, dangerous streets where Kolchak investigated supernatural mysteries, and the warm, chaotic living room of A Christmas Story, where family life unfolded in all its messy glory. Throughout his career, he resisted being pigeonholed or boxed into narrow categories. He pushed against the very shows that made him famous and stepped away entirely when Hollywood's expectations no lease. Unger matched his own vision for his career. Yet the great irony is that those same roles he once tried to keep at a distance are now the ones ensuring his name and his work continue to resonate with new audiences decades later. Kolchak remains a cult touchstone, inspiring writers and filmmakers who weren't even born when it first aired on television. A Christmas Story continues to weave him into family traditions every December, keeping his voice, mannerisms, and sly smile alive for new generations of viewers who discover the film each year. McGavin didn't live to see the full scale of this cultural afterlife, or to understand completely how much his work would mean to people far beyond his own time. But in the glow of holiday marathons, in the grainy late-night screenings of The Night Stalker, and in the countless fan discussions that refuse to let his memory fade, his spirit is still there, that wry grin, stubborn charm, and unshakable presence that made him so memorable. Perhaps that's the final twist in Darren McGavin's story. He may have stepped out of the spotlight by choice, preferring privacy and peace to the demands of fame, but the spotlight, in its own way, has never stopped following him. Through the enduring power of the characters he created and the moments he brought to life, he remains a vital part of popular culture, proving that sometimes the most lasting fame comes not from chasing it, but from the honest work of bringing truth and humanity to every role, no matter how big or small.